Optimal health for high performers. This is the Health Upgrade Podcast with Dr. Nawaz Habib.
Hello, welcome back to the Health Upgrade Podcast. This is Dr. Habib, and I'm very, very excited about today's episode. We just finished recording with Brendan Vermeire. Brendan is one of the coolest guys I think I've ever met. We had the opportunity to connect when we both spoke at a microbiome labs and PLMI event in Denver in September last year. And we hit it off with just this entire conversation that had everything to do with the modulation of microglial cells. And if you remember, microglial cells are the immune cell, the primary immune cell in the brain that's required for optimal brain function. And Brendan's entire business is built around the concept of microglial activation syndrome. And I love the conversation that we just finished having with him. Myself, JP, and Brendan really went deep into the science and then pulled right back into a lot of the clinical tools, the best exercises, the best way to help to maintain and optimize the state of these microglial cells and how important it is to mental health, physical health, metabolic health. Just an overall wonderful conversation with Brendan Vermeire. I hope you enjoy this one. We'll catch you at the end of it. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. It's Dr. Habib here with JP Erico, our co-host, and our wonderful guest, Brendan Vermeire. Thanks for joining us, Brendan.
Thanks for having me, my friend. I'm excited to chat with you both and talk about some cool science stuff.
Absolutely. We're gonna really dig into the nerd science here a little bit. I think it's something I'm very interested in, JP is very interested in, and something that you promote a lot on social and in your work. Why don't we get started with what brought you into the functional world to begin with, a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, no, certainly it could be like a super long sob story. I've gotten really good at sort of consolidating it because my background is nutrition and fitness. And so I come from the world of metabolic physiology and optimizing health and performance more through that metabolic lens, lifelong athlete and fitness buff and all that stuff. And so in the early stages of my career, I was like 18, 19, 21-ish. I was actually really struggling with my mental health a lot. And certainly these days, like metabolic psychiatry is starting to kind of pick up momentum as a thing, which is probably like 3 decades overdue, but nonetheless, here we are. And so I'm glad to see that because certainly if we're talking about root cause factors of mental, neuropsychiatric, neurodegenerative stuff, that metabolic component is huge. But part of the point I want to make is I had the metabolic health. I was very fit, very healthy. My mental health struggles were not metabolic in origin, right? And, I went through my whole scary thing of being, hospitalized after a suicide attempt and, going through a really toxic relationship that ended with her killing herself. Like there's this, crazy backstory to all of it. But ultimately, it was trying to navigate my own mental health struggles and trying to quite literally save my ex-fiance. That's what steered me into functional medicine because she really came down with this mysterious illness that nobody could figure out. And this isn't exaggerated at all, where she literally was wasting away. Her demeanor became way more volatile. She had a lot of like neurological symptoms going on, peripheral neuropathy, numbness, tingling, ice pick pain that was kind of moving throughout her body. So I was trying to, do research to figure out what was going on with her because our conventional doctor had no solutions, although we did get turned on to MTHFR because they had run that marker. We went to naturopathic, chiropractic, physical therapy, acupuncture, doing parasite cleanses, like nothing was helping. And so I started going down these rabbit holes. But ultimately, it was the research I was doing to try to save her that then steered me into functional medicine. And while she's no longer with us, I'm here and now this has just taken over my life. So that's kind of the short of it.
Thank you for your vulnerability and sharing. I can't imagine what that was like going through, but you learned from it, you were able to gain some knowledge and hopefully help a lot of people in the future dealing with mental health challenges to not go down that same path, right? We can't
For sure.
really, we can use what's in the past to try to benefit everybody in the future and the present. So thank you for that work and for sharing that.
Oh, no, thank you guys. I mean, that's the goal, right? Paying it forward. There's a lot of, turning your pain into your purpose and your mission. I always like to say that my work is my medicine. And I mean that pretty literally. Like my work and my service in this realm is very therapeutic for me, as I continue navigating my path. So it's a pleasure.
Absolutely. It's how you heal. And I appreciate that. So let's get into some of those mechanisms, some of those learnings that you've had over the last few decades, I imagine. So let's dig into it. You're really focused on microglial activation as a major driver of mental health conditions and other brain-based challenges. We talk a lot about microglia, but why don't we do a little basic intro and then start talking about some of the more clinical findings that you've been able to help people overcome?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. I think it's really interesting. We're in this age of information and so much research is coming out. It's a rapidly evolving field. But I will start by boldly saying, it's impossible to really be up to date on the research of neuropsychiatric conditions, neurodevelopmental or neurodegeneration, which that's on a spectrum and people don't get that. And the microglia are really what regulate that, of whether we're talking about the fact that autism is now 1 in 36 American children, whether we're talking about, depression being the leading cause of morbidity worldwide, whether we're talking about Alzheimer's being the 6th or 7th leading cause of death for Americans, or cerebrovascular disease. The microglia are at the heart of this. And so, for a long time, we've kind of been taught and told and sold this narrative by pharma that, mental illness is really the result of brain chemical imbalances. We don't know why it happens. There's a genetic factor. There's not really anything you can do about it. So you take the neuropsychiatric drug that balances the brain chemicals and you talk to somebody, right? And
the monoamine theory of mental health and
exactly.
Pharma. It's not wrong, but it's just so limited. It's just such a tiny little piece of what's really going on. We talk a lot on the podcast about the sort of the triangle of the autonomic nervous system, metabolism. So I'm really fascinated by the fact that you jumped right in, 1 minute in, you were talking about, metabolic dysfunction really being a big driver. And then the innate immune system and the microglial cells are part of that innate immune system. And all three are really the core. They're the three stools that hold up, the three legs of the stool that hold up everything in your body. So when one of them is dysfunctional, it affects everything else. So, to your point.
Yeah, exactly. The monoamine theory, at this point, it's outdated, right? It's incomplete. It's outdated. It's not wrong. But, now as we're really seeing, it's there's a lot of upstream physiological factors that are probably going to be going on before we see sort of this, transmission dysregulation, right? And so the microglia, just defining those for the audience, obviously, of the innate white blood cell of the central nervous system, right? And they are nearly identical in structure and function to the peripheral macrophage or monocyte. In fact, they used to, think the microglia were macrophages that had migrated into the parenchyma of the central nervous system. And they're like, wait, these have totally different cellular origins. These are different cells, but very similar. And so I always like to refer to these microglia as both the architects and the guardians of the central nervous system, because they are the sentinel immune cells. If there's an insult, pathogen, foreign invader, whatever, they're tasked with fighting it off, clearing it up with, the cleansing fire of inflammation and its oxidative mechanisms with inducible nitric oxide synthase and all that cool stuff. But there's also this extremely powerful sculpting and regenerative role that they play. So when we talk about the neurodevelopment that happens in utero, and obviously the first however many years of life, it is the microglia sculpting and then maintaining the neural networks. and ideally preventing the degeneration. And so the fact that we see neurodevelopmental disorders on the rise, mental health disorders on the rise, neurodegenerative, the microglia steal the show.
Yeah, and they actually also build the vasculature. They build the connections. They promote oligodendrocytes and the myelination of those connections. So they're involved in white matter development. They control the astrocytes, which are the cells that literally sit on top of both the vasculature to maintain the blood-brain barrier, and also the synapses and control. They're basically almost like the muffler or the volume control on synapses. They're incredibly important, and yet they listen to what the microglia have to say. It's interesting that you say that in your mind the microglial cells are really just like macrophages, and then you said monocytes, and I always think of it sort of as an unfortunate artifact of history that circulating monocytes that migrate into tissue and differentiate into macrophages are called macrophages, because the microglial cells in the central nervous system, they don't come from monocytes, as you said. That's not how they are derived. The microglial cells are there with you from the earliest stages of gestation, and we spent some time talking about that on neurodevelopment and in gestation, how that process happens. And those same microglial cells, we're actually talking about the same exact cells, are with you from the earliest stages of neurodevelopment in utero, all the way through until your death. And actually, we actually had Dr. Maria Tremblay on, and I've continued to dialogue with her and working with her. 8 hours after you're dead, those microglial cells are still roaming around in your brain trying to fix things. So they're just the most fascinating cell to me. I mean, it's just unbelievably important. And you're right. Yes, they are immune cells in their origin, but much the same way those same innate and tissue resident macrophages in your liver, in your kidneys, in your heart, your lungs, et cetera. Yes, they're capable of being your defenders and protectors, but you almost don't want them doing that. That's like the last thing that they should be doing. They should be maintaining and supporting and regenerating after damage the tissue, because that's really the job. And when they do that, you're healthy. So let's dig into how those microglial cells in the brain can get dysfunctional.
Absolutely. And that becomes that's why microglial activation really became it's literally the focal point of everything about my career. It's the focal point of my branding and my business model and my methodology and the panel that I developed of what biomarkers do we use to qualify the likelihood of microglial activation and neuroinflammation.
That's
and
brilliant.
then it was, yeah, thank you. I will have to nerd out about it a little bit, because there's so much going on there. And then you look at all of the many root cause factors that can contribute to this dysregulation in the morphology of the microglial cells and the phenotype they're expressing. So I think as we enter this conversation, recognizing, because a lot of times, you guys can appreciate this, a lot of times in our industry, practitioners are kind of quick to blame the cells on being dysfunctional, right? The cells are misbehaving. And it's the cells are not misbehaving. They are appropriately responding to the environment that they're floating around in and marinating in, right? So if we want, whereas big pharma, of course, they're spending tons of money in research, what drugs or therapeutics can we put in to modulate the activity of the microglial cells synthetically? So that way we don't have to deal with those pesky environmental lifestyle, root cause factors, right? Let's just, flip the switch and get them to do what we want them to do. But what we have to talk about from a functional perspective is, what input signals are changing the milieu, the cytokine, chemokine, oxidative, nitrosative milieu that is then triggering, the polarization of the microglia to this excess of the pro-inflammatory cytotoxic M1 phenotype, as you're alluding to.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a wet wired system. When you talk to neurologists, they are very concerned about, okay, what's one neuron saying to another? They understand astrocytes, and they are willing to include them in the mix and the discussion, but it's very rare to find a neurologist who's actually really interested in talking about inflammation, talking about the effects of, again, I'm going to come back to it because it's so important in the three legs of the stool, the role that metabolism plays. We know that as immune cells transition from that state that they're in normally, which is that neurotrophic state in the brain, that tissue supportive maintenance role that they play. When they're in that role, oxidative phosphorylation is going strong, their mitochondria are healthy. But when they shift into that inflamed state, damage starts to happen inside that immune cell itself. There's damage that's happening at the mitochondrial level. They aren't producing energy in the same way. They shift over to a oxidative or a fermented state where they're relying on glycolysis. So you can actually see them start to malfunction themselves. They're also causing dysfunction externally. You have to slow that down. You have to bring it back to that healthy neurotrophic state quickly, because if it just stays there, those cells do become dysfunctional. What are some of the things that you look for? Because you said you're developing a panel to look for the signs that those microglial cells are getting dysfunctional.
Yeah, I mean, there's a disconnect between obviously like what scientists can measure in research laboratories versus what we can measure commercially through biomarkers. So I do think in time we will have more clinical biomarkers commercially available that are more specific to microglia activation, but we already have so many. For example, like good old fashioned classic C-reactive protein. We see that microglia cells can actually produce C-reactive protein. We see that C-reactive protein can increase pericellular permeability of the blood-brain barrier. We see that CRP is associated with neuroinflammation, right? While the traditional argument of CRP of like, oh, it's only made by the liver, interleukin-6, it's really just peripheral inflammation, and that's simply not true. There's copious amounts of research that show otherwise. But then we can get even more specific with more advanced biomarkers. So some of the ones that I've identified as being most pertinent for microglial cells, like yes, CRP, but I think more specifically myeloperoxidase, neoterin, MMP9, quinolinic acid, looking at some of these markers reflective of, glial activation, immune activation, inflammation in general. And then part of what I did, because I like to think I'm clever, is, looking at some of these immune activation inflammatory markers. But ultimately, to your point, JP, if there is enough, I think of neuroinflammation as a spectrum. You don't have it or you don't have it. It's where is it? It's in constant flux. Every time you get a little stress or a little bug or some sort of insult, it's going to flare up. And to your point, it should resolve. It should calm down. But the majority of the population is so dysfunctional that they are kind of constantly in this excess leaning to that M1 pro-inflammatory phenotype. And so then what's going to happen if we have these microglial cells excessively, spitting out inflammatory oxidative, molecules all the time? At some point, it's going to start damaging our neurons and our brain cells, right? So this is where neurofilament light chain has emerged as far and ahead the single best biomarker that we can measure in the blood that is directly related to brain cell damage and neuron damage. So my strategy is looking at these markers in the blood reflective of all of this, and also looking at that neurofilament light chain, because you can kind of get this picture of, you could have somebody with lots of inflammation, but it's not yet to the point that's causing like neurodegeneration. Whereas like somebody that's like, let's say 80, 90 years old and they've had Alzheimer's, Parkinson's for a decade, and it's just been going and going and going, they'll have the elevated inflammatory markers and extremely high levels of neurofilament light chain because their brain has been degenerating for a decade. So,
that's a really interesting point, because a lot of, and I'm so happy you brought up quinolinic acid, because that we've talked on the podcast about the effect of inflammation on the production of key neurotransmitters. So going back to that monoamine theory, oh, you don't have enough serotonin, oh, you don't have enough norepinephrine, so we have to give you these drugs that block the reuptake of those neurotransmitters so you have enough. So those are the SSRIs and the SNRIs that are literally given out like Skittles to nowadays. But at the end of the day, the disruption of the production of those neurotransmitters really boils down to the presence of inflammatory cytokines, which signal to the immune system and to the cells that there's inflammation around, the potential for a microbe. And so there's this shift in the biosynthetic pathways in the direction of creating more free radicals, reactive oxygen species, et cetera. And, that's part metabolic, that's part inflammatory. At the end of the day, you were also talking about how we live our lives, driving ourselves into that inflamed, that permanently hyperexcitable state that leads to all those problems. And so this brings it around to a question that I have, and I don't know the answer, but maybe you have some insights that I'd love to hear. There are certain consequences of those dysfunctional pathways that lead to things like migraine headaches. They lead to insomnia. They lead to depression. They lead to brain fog. Some of those are associated with long-term neurodegenerative problems, but other ones are actually considered at this point to be almost signs that you're not going to have neurodegenerative problems. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Migraine headaches, if you talk to the top leading migraine specialists, they'll say, oh, it's terrible that you're suffering with migraines, Mrs. Jones, but the good news is you're less likely to have Alzheimer's. Okay. I'm sure I want to make that trade-off, but okay. But at the same time, you're not getting enough sleep or depression or other things that are associated with the same inflammation. They are associated with a higher level of neurodegenerative disorders. Do you, and maybe we're just going to blue sky here, but do you have any thoughts on why it would be that some of the consequences of neuroinflammation would be protective against neurodegeneration while others seem to almost promote it? Do you have any thoughts? I mean, and maybe we're going to dive off a deep end into just speculation here, but do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, I'm all for speculation and theory because that paves the way for what research needs to be done. And, with that, for example, I remember when I was developing I have a 40-hour course that's just on this one subject, right? And deep dive into the science and the biomarkers. And I specifically remember it was either a paper more so looking at maybe like erythrocyte sedimentation rate or fibrinogen, one of the two. And what the paper was really arguing was, well, actually, like when we have, this inflammation, it's neuroprotective, right? Because this is where, to your point, we have to kind of back up and it's like, neuroinflammation is not bad, unto itself, right? Chronic, dysregulated, non-resolving neuroinflammation is really
Sure.
the issue. Like if I get COVID for the 5th time tomorrow and then I have a fever, like I want that neuroinflammation and inducible nitric oxide synthase and microglial response to defend my brain from that COVID. And so, we don't know all the answers, but it would be interesting to see some of that, of ultimately the individuals that maybe they're having, the migraines or even sort of anxiety, insomnia, brain fog, depression, some of these sort of like acute symptoms of a neuroinflammatory process. But if the neuroinflammation is able to get the job done and resolve, the microglial cells are able to, like one of the things I've seen through literature is, obviously we've got like our quiescent microglial cells and then activated with the major phenotypes, M1 pro-inflammatory, M2 anti-inflammatory. And then there's like subphenotypes, and that goes to just a different meta level. But it seems too like these microglial cells, they're dynamic enough. They can be a little bit M1 and a little bit M2. They can be pleiotropic. They can, maybe be pumping out some inflammatory mediators and some neurotrophic, neuroprotective mediators at the same time. So I kind of think of it as like that, like somebody that's forging like a sword or something. They stick it in the fire to make it malleable and bang it into shape, then dip it in the cold water to sort of harden it, freeze it. I kind of picture that with how the microglial cells are modulating the synaptic connection. So I don't know. I mean, to your point with some of those symptoms, if they have a healthy, robust inflammatory response that resolves it, it could then be, neuroprotective in the long run.
I think that's probably right. I remember back when I was first studying migraine, how surprised I was that some of the hyperactivity, the hyper excitability phenomena like cortical spreading depressions, that the presence of TNF alpha actually is protective against those things occurring. So it's just, you never know whether the immune system's response is going to be damaging or helpful. You want it to be helpful. And there's lots of really helpful things like sleep, for example. Just getting to sleep. The process of getting to sleep actually requires microglial cells to express certain inflammatory markers. And so, and the pruning of the network involves that microglial cells are so critically involved in, that process involves mimicking the inflammatory process of phagocytosis. It's trogocytosis. It's only nibbling away, but it still has to behave in a pro-inflammatory like way. So you're absolutely right. It's a spectrum. So it's a very complicated subject, and I'm sure 40 hours just touches the surface. I'm intrigued by your program.
Thank you. Well, and that's why, like, something I preach a lot is, as practitioners, we have to make sure we're spending more time tracking physiology than chasing root causes, right? Because ultimately, we can look at all these cool mechanisms, but we have to see what's the net effect of all these many moving pieces over the course of time, right? And so that's where, I've been kind of doing this research with my panel that's called the mental map. MAP stands for microglial activation profile. Really sexy branding, better science, but that's kind of the point of I've been, looking at a lot of these markers in a lot of people for a long enough time. And it's really interesting to kind of see that moving picture over time. And you see things creeping up, creeping down, even at like a subclinical level, so obviously somebody at like a neurodegenerative level. But one of the things too, you had comments on with like the quinolinic acid, to me, it doesn't make sense to try to like balance the brain chemicals, balance the neurotransmitters until, the microglial activation is really addressed, because a lot of these brain cells, the neurons, the oligodendrocytes, the astrocytes, the glial cells, most of them express these two core intracellular biochemical enzymes, the IDO1 that generates the quinolinic acid, and then GTPCH1, which generates the neopterin or bioterin. And so what we do see, like a lot of times it's called like the tryptophan steal, which is cute. I don't know if it's fully accurate, but it's cute, where kind of this idea of, okay, well, when activated, the glial cells kind of gobble up the tryptophan, produce this noxious NMDA agonist of the quinolinic acid and everything. In neopterin, these two pathways run parallel. I mean, they're just biochemical pathways. But the neopterin, as that's going up, bioterin BH4, which is our major cofactor to produce the serotonin, the dopamine, the nitric oxide, all of that gets dysregulated. So, if we see elevated neopterin, whether that's cerebrospinal fluid, blood, urine, you can measure in any of the above, or like quinolinic acid, which is usually measured in the urine. If those are elevated, like that's the priority, because we're not really going to be able to effectively, improve the neurotransmission component until that's addressed, in my opinion.
One of the things that we've talked about before is, serotonin is, yes, it's a two-step process from tryptophan to serotonin, but then there's another two-step process down to melatonin. Mm-hmm. And, most people think of melatonin as associated with sleep. It's generated in the pineal gland, but that's the secreted melatonin. Every cell in your body, with the possible exception of red blood cells, makes serotonin and makes melatonin, because melatonin is critical for, again, mitochondrial function. And so I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the role of melatonin, and again, coming back to how melatonin and inflammation and the lack of melatonin as a result impacts mitochondria, and what does that do to overall metabolism in the central nervous system, because again, those are the legs of the stool.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty dynamic picture because, I mean, with like the quinolinic acid, Terran, for example, I mean, if those pathways are dysregulating neurotransmitter synthesis, serotonin, melatonin synthesis, I mean, the simple argument would be like, okay, we don't have enough serotonin to feel happy and we don't have enough melatonin to sleep. But there's also a lot of ways, I think, to kind of circumvent and sort of augment that, because I do think, supplemental melatonin or supplemental 5-HTP. So usually, like when I'm working with a client in real time, kind of down in the trenches, sort of this, I don't want to say microglial inhibition, but more modulation and calming the immunological inflammatory response. But I do still think we can support, those neurotransmitters directly with the precursors or with melatonin supplementation, because part of it, anything that we can do to change the milieu, to change the environment from this pro-inflammatory oxidized nitrosative and shift it to this more antioxidative, anti-inflammatory, I think that's really where a lot of the healing is going to happen. And that's where a lot, the melatonin or glutathione or there's so many things that we can do to try to shift that milieu. And then, of course, supplements and therapeutics aside, it's like, yeah, but the environmental input signals, the lifestyle input signals, right? Like, we can give them all the supplements we want, but if they're diabetic, if they're, homocysteine is at 20, if, they're huffing a lot of air pollution, it's just going to be like this uphill battle.
So one of the things that I get concerned about, especially about the use of SSRIs and SNRIs, is that when you start using those drugs, they have a short-term effect of increasing the amount of serotonin that's in the synapse, which is their purpose. But it has the other side effect, which is to increase the number of transporters that the cells are expressing. And by increasing the number of transporters, it's sort of accelerating the rate at which serotonin can be pulled out of the synapse. So it's one of the reasons why they say you can't just go cold turkey on serotonin reuptake inhibitors, because if you do, then you're going to really deplete the synapse. And the reason why is because the cells need that serotonin. So yes, they're releasing some, but if they're having a problem making it, they're going to be more thirsty to bring it back in. So I guess the question I have is, do you believe that supplementation of 5-HT or tryptophan, et cetera, how far upstream do you have to go before you might actually be triggering the opposite goal, the opposite thing that you want? Because at the end of the day, what you really want to do is get the cell to produce the right amount of serotonin. You want them to be functioning in that homeostatic range as opposed to a dysfunctional space. And sometimes when you supplement, you can temporarily provide what you need, but in the long term, you're actually making it more dysregulated. I always think of the story. I have a family member who's in the spine field, and he says he always sort of jokes sardonically that if he never really knows whether or not he needs to do that first spine fusion, but he knows he's going to have to do the second one. Mm. So, we don't know whether or not you have to give the SSRI, but we know that once you're on it, you can't come off it, and you might need to cycle through other ones. So I guess where upstream do you feel most comfortable with? Is it the precursors?
Well, it's a little tricky because part of it, even with like SSRIs as a good example, the literature shows that SSRIs seem to have a bit of an anti-neuroinflammatory effect and seem to promote, neuroplasticity. And something that really interests me about like pharmaceutical science and the pharmacokinetics is like, okay, maybe the mechanism that the drug is really working upon is, blocking the reuptake of serotonin. But then what's the physiological effect? Because like the SSRIs seem to activate tyrosine kinase B and get the transcription and production of BDNF going and seem to have this sort of anti-neuroinflammatory effect to some extent, which is why like the SSRIs get used a lot for, chronic pain and chronic fatigue and stuff like that as well. In neurotransmitters were like my first love. scientifically. Like it was like the first thing I'm like, this stuff is so cool. And the deeper and deeper I get into it, the more nuanced it really gets. Because then you start looking at, like I was just having a conversation with some practitioners earlier about the clinical validity or perhaps lack thereof, like urinary neurotransmitter testing. What do we do with that tool? And is it really reflective of what's going on in the CNS? Because you start looking at some of those components of like receptor quantity and expression, saturation. You see the same thing with like testosterone replacement therapy, for example. You get guys on, 100, 200 milligrams testosterone a week. And as you're saturating those androgen receptors at the nuclear level, then, they're kind of becoming unresponsive. So you got to give them that next hit. But to your point, like if somebody is, already on an SSRI, the analogy, and it's probably grossly simplistic for the level of nuance that we're talking about, but it's like if you're trying to make orange juice, you can squeeze an orange as much as you want. But if there's no more juice in that orange, you're not going to get more out of it. So it's like you can keep blocking the reuptake of serotonin, but at some point, like you do need those cells producing the serotonin to begin with, which is where those precursors come in. And then you start sprinkling in like the nuance of the psychobiome and all of that. It gets really convoluted really quick.
Yeah, and the question is, if you're providing the precursors, but you haven't changed the way the cell is using the tryptophan,
yeah,
are you actually accelerating the amount of quinolinic acid, kynurenine, and the rest of the pathway? And again, it's so funny because the end of that pathway, quinolinic acid is sort of the penultimate, product of that synthetic pathway. It's actually NAD. And so the NAD is obviously so important for the mitochondria and the whole electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. So, you've got melatonin and you got NAD and you've got, what's happening here when, as you said, you give an SSRI. Yeah. Okay. The pharmaceutical companies will tell you that that's blocking the reuptake of serotonin. It's leaving serotonin in the synapse and you feel better. Okay, but why is it having an effect on chronic fatigue when we use those drugs? Is it because you're actually enabling that reuptake of the serotonin, or you're enabling the serotonin to be utilized to make melatonin, and as a result, you're supporting the mitochondria? And because, is chronic fatigue at some level really a metabolic disease, not a central nervous system? It's actually a metabolic disease. So I agree with you. I think that it's far more nuanced than I think we're ready to answer. But we're using the right tools to figure it out.
I never give tryptophan, for the record. Like you're kind of alluding to that there. Of like I never do the tryptophan, especially if they have any of the excess neuroinflammation indices or anything, or the higher quinolinic acid. Because in my mind, I'm like, I don't want to feed that pathway more. Whereas 5-HTP, one enzymatic reaction forward, you can't go into that pathway. But I think you and I are looking at a lot of the same research, because like even with that IDO1 kynurenic quinolinic pathway with NAD as the ultimate end product, I have yet to find any research that really teases that out of like, we don't know yet, scientists don't know yet how that pathway is really regulated. We do see plenty of research that's like, hey, PTSD, neuroinflammation, neurodegeneration, all depression, a lot of these kind of neuroinflammation-based conditions, we constantly see the elevated kynurenic and quinolinic. But what even the research is not clear on is like, but how is that regulated? Of like, when does the kynurenic get converted to quinolinic, and when does that get converted to NAD, which you would think is a good thing? So, there's a lot of unknowns there. And this is where, I always am like, the body is so much wiser than we are, forged through eons of evolution and science. We're always just trying to catch up with what has already existed. So to me, this is why I love holistic functional approaches, because like these complex mechanisms that we don't fully understand, these pathways in the regulation, But what we do know is if we change, the environment, the input signals, we can restore homeostasis more effectively. And the drug research does a good job of showing us that, because they're isolating mechanisms and doing robust clinical trials that demonstrate the physiological effect of working at the mechanistic level. But then a big part of my career is, well, let's take that understanding and then apply it holistically.
I love that. I'd love to kind of step back into that holistic functional world a little bit. You alluded to something earlier, and I very much appreciate it, where in the functional world, we tend to get hyper-focused on the root causes. We become hyper-focused on the environmental pollution or the gluten that's the main driver. Or, we've got so many of those root causes on that tree image that we love to show. And we've got all these conditions that have been labeled on the ICD-11 now. We have like 10,000 different conditions that are all listed there. And that common pathway that you alluded to is really what we need to do, is have resolution of inflammation as a real possibility. We need to drive resolution to the inflammation so that the signals to those microglial cells, in the particular cases we're talking about, are able to get there and regulate macrophage activity or microglial activity to allow it to go back to a regulatory mechanism. So let's talk a little bit about some of those clinical kind of cases that you tend to start to notice. Okay, we've got these root causes. What are the main drivers of that control of inflammation that you start to work on with your clients? Because you want to create that opportunity for the work that you then do in the resolution of those root causes to actually be maintainable. So what are some of the things you do to help to control the inflammatory process in the first place?
Generally, what I've found, and what's funny about our industry is, like, obviously we love exploring root causes. We love running lab testing. We love nerding out on some of this stuff. And we love to try to be bio-individualized. But at the same time, the population that we're working with are more in common than not. And so we are going to be probably doing a lot of the same work with this, people over and over and over. So, with sort of bio-individuality noted, I definitely keep finding my top 3 priorities from more of like a mechanistic perspective. It's nutrient status, blood flow and oxygenation, lymphatic flow, and microbiome support in general. Those usually become my top 3 priorities of, like, if I can restore, the microbiota and all the health implications of that, if I can optimize nitric oxide status for the sake of literally everything that does, which is conversation unto itself. And then just the essential nutrient status. For example, let me give like a real life. This just happened this week, where literally I had, these parents, reach out, a referral from another practitioner, right? And it's like this 15-year-old girl who, so she had COVID and strep throat about a year ago. Nothing has ever been the same since, and is having all these, brain fog, apathy, but even more scary neurological symptoms like rigidity or even like catatonia or kind of passing out sort of things. So they came to me really like brain on fire, neuroinflammation, stealth infections, long haul syndrome. Oh my gosh, all of that. And I kid you not, like, I did the most extensive, panel I think I've ever done with all of the fancy inflammatory infection markers, the procalcitonin, the galectin-3, the neoterin, all of it, you name it, it was on that panel. C4A, CD57, all of it. Not a lick of that. The immunological inflammatory markers, not any of them were really out of range in the slightest. But the things that stood out the most out of this like $2,000 lab testing, hypoglycemia, questionable hypoxia and like subclinical anemia, dyslipidemia, like very, very basic metabolic perturbations, right? And so my challenge to the parents was like, look, because they've already been through neurologists, rheumatologists, immunologists, infectious disease, cardiologists, and all of them scratching their heads going, autonomic dysfunction, which, that's right up your alley with vagal stuff, yep. Right? And so my challenge to the parents, I'm like, I think nutrition is a big focal point here. I want you guys to see as, get a CGM, get a HRV. Are her episodes with her passing out and having these weird neurological things, does it correspond with blood sugar dips, blood sugar crashes, blood flow, right? So part of what I'm getting at is, are there some people that they do have major inflammatory issues? Yes. And it's easy to measure with the right biomarkers. But what I keep seeing over and over is people are really psyched out. There's a lot of psychosomatic, there's a lot of, nervous system dysregulation, autonomic dysfunction, but basic metabolic issues that are then driving a lot of these things. And people are so quick to like, well, what's the scary root cause and what's the silver bullet? And it's like, actually, I just need you eating more protein and stabilizing your blood sugar and getting your red blood cell and hemoglobin up. And then if you're still having issues, maybe we can talk a little bit more.
So it's that really ties into some work that we've talked about on the podcast in the past that I did, probably 9 years ago when we went over to the UK and we were looking to find people who had a series of different medical problems that all seemed to run together. It involved headache because we were focused a lot on migraine and headache conditions, but it involved depression and anxiety, widespread pain, even things like asthma and sinusitis, sleep disorders, et cetera. And what we found was all those sort of conditions that run together are associated with that underlying autonomic nervous system dysfunction. And when you actually spoke to those patients, it's a lot. It sort of resonated when you talked about this 15-year-old who had sort of simultaneously or back-to-back COVID and a bacterial infection. What you saw was that patients oftentimes talked about the fact that there was some event in their lives, whether it was a surgery, an accident, even a psychological trauma like losing their mother or losing a sibling or something like that, that triggered them and that they've never been right since, and that they've had these symptoms. And I actually find it interesting because, I talk about the fact that if a patient shows up at a doctor's office today and says, listen, I've got, my stomach is a mess, my head hurts, I'm having sleep problems, I'm feeling kind of down, my nose is running, I'm having breathing difficulties. The first thing the doctor is going to want to do is find a root cause that is, culturing them for a virus or a bacterial infection and treating them with an antibiotic or something like that. But the moment that patient says, no, I've been having these symptoms consistently for 5 years, unfortunately, Western medicine just sort of throws up their hands and actually runs out of the room screaming, saying, not another one of these patients. And we're living with 10 to 12% of the population having these problems. And what literally 8 years of research has told me is that there's a program that runs in your brainstem, which I refer to simply as the sick program. And basically your brainstem is taking in billions of bits of information a day and having to process them the same way your optic nerve brings information in and has to process it for your visual field. It's telling you how you should feel. And there's a lot of preconceived bias that goes into that. And if you've spent a long time being sick, your brain begins to feel as if, or begins to function as if being sick and having these symptoms are what it's supposed to do. And there's a reason why that respiratory bug or that digestive bug, they all have the same symptoms, because the symptoms are designed for you to change your behavior so that you'll lie down, you'll stop eating, you'll sleep through the day, all of those things that you do when you're sick. It's being driven by the symptoms that you're experiencing. And we can get stuck in that mode. Our brains can actually get stuck. We do that with animal models. We get them stuck in that mode so that they'll experience long-term pain conditions that we can then study medications or treatments on. So I think that patients like that 15-year-old are experiencing that program being switched on and they can't switch it off. And that's why, we're focused on how the autonomic nervous system can use neuroplasticity, change how the microglia are functioning so that you can unwind that sympathetic overdrive that they're stuck in so that they can experience sort of a resolution of all of those symptoms. So, maybe bringing this around to the autonomic nervous system, how do you incorporate modulation of the autonomic nervous system into what you do? I mean, obviously, meditation and deep breathing and things like that are really great tools, but what else do you do?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. And then I want to ping it to Navaz because, like, while you were saying that, it had me thinking of, the majority of the rat models that they use for like PTSD specifically. Mm-hmm. I find this to be, such a fascinating area of research within kind of mental health, neuropsychiatric. The PTSD research that's coming out is so cool, right? Because to your point, and this is why, we're having a very technical conversation around neuroinflammation, neuroplasticity, which are the two subjects my whole business is built around. And then, how I speak to neuroinflammation, neuroplasticity to the public is in a more conceptual way, but it's still rooted in concrete, mechanistic stuff. Because that's why I think neuroplasticity as a concept is so empowering, because people don't feel like there's something wrong with me and I'm going to be stuck this way forever. It's like, wait, you're telling me that I have the ability, I have the power to change the way my neural networks are literally wiring and firing, right? Like that's very attractive in general. And when I look at some of the trauma research where it's like, okay, they've got all these great established models for trauma and PTSD with rats of, the tail suspension test. Let's dangle the rats by their tails until they're traumatized and their glial cells are activated. Let's, inject them with LPS to activate the microglia. Let's do the forced swim test. They feel like they're drowning, or clamp their little mouse paws and electrocute the mouse paws until they're traumatized. Like these are all established models, right?
Literal torture.
Yeah, literally. It sucks.
They all channel through the same mechanism. Whether you're doing it chemically, physically, electrically, just keeping them awake for too long, all of those channels bring it back through this threat response mode that the autonomic nervous system has. It views all of those threats and says, what do I do when I'm threatened? I entered that sympathetic overdrive. How do I get out of that? If you stay there too long, you're stuck.
Exactly. And regardless of how they induce, the trauma and the stress response, the sympathetic response, the glial neuroinflammatory response, some of the therapeutics that they are looking at with some of that PTSD, like rat research, like even vitamin D, for example, of like, okay, we traumatize the rats, get those microglial cells, inflamed and everything, if you will, and do like high dose vitamin D. And that has sort of this modulating inhibitory effect on the neuroinflammation, or monoclonal antibodies, or, a big one that they're looking at a lot is minocycline, tetracycline antibiotic, crosses the blood-brain barrier, inhibits, AKA shifts the microglial phenotype. And then what's cool, because, right, they traumatize the rats and then see how do the rats socialize? How do they navigate mazes, stuff like that. And so to your point, what's really cool is even if all they do, traumatize the rats, okay, now they're avoidant, they're anxious, they're depressive, they can't navigate mazes, stuff like that. So we know that they have these PTSD symptoms now, and we know that their glial cells are activated, all these things. And then they'll just give something like minocycline to mechanistically treat the neuroinflammation. And now some of those anxiety behaviors and, symptoms kind of go away, just because they switched the glial activation and the phenotype there using an inhibitory agent. But that's where I think there's the fun part of the conversation of all the many things we can do to cause that shift. And then I'll ping it to you, Navaz, because something I preach a lot, you can't talk your way out of neuroinflammation. You can do all the therapy that you want. But like if you really are in this dysregulated, excess sympathetic tone, excess neuroinflammation, this heightened state, this cell danger response, you can't talk your way out of that. You can't reason or rationalize or logic. So Navaz, I'm curious too, because this ties in perfectly with modulating the vagal pathways and the cholinergic pathways.
That's exactly right. The main driver that we have internally, and I love that you kind of brought up all of the things that we can do through research and through supplementation, through dietary, through talk therapy. They're all wonderful, but they can only work when the microglia are modulated into a state where they're in a regulatory neuroplastic functioning state. And the main driver that we have as an internal mechanism present on every single one of those microglial cells is that alpha 7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. That is the driver of that shift that our bodies have created internally. So there's nothing better than providing the right amount of acetylcholine via vagus nerve stimulation, via in the brain specifically, nucleus bacillus of Maynard being activated through vagus nerve pathways turning on, right? We need to be able to shift our state to parasympathetic, to rest, digest, and recover. And that's where we can then have the internal modulating effect. And that's where the talk therapy will work better. That's where specific supplementation will have a more beneficial effect. We have to create that state shift first. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in how we talk about inflammation is that we've almost made inflammation into a diagnosis, when in reality, it's not. It's entirely a process. And it's a process that is adaptive to what's happening around. And what's often lost is that the control of the inflammation piece is the missing piece to this whole puzzle. I think that one switch, if it's flipped effectively, will allow for all of the other pieces to that process to start to work more effectively, more optimally. And that's where we can have recovery and health optimization and longevity and all of these fun pieces occur. But it all truly begins with being able to control the inflammatory process. There's this, I'm going to go to a fun analogy here just because it's my favorite movie, The Matrix. If you remember the conversation that Neo had with one of the elders, I believe it was in the second movie, he said, what's the difference between the machines that are using us in the Matrix and the machines that we're using to help the city of Zion work? And the answer was control. We have control over the machines that we're utilizing in the city to ensure that people can live, and they have control over us. We don't have control over them when they're utilizing us as batteries and the whole kind of idea of the Matrix. The key is control. The key is, do we have the ability to create that modulation internally? And are there mechanisms and tools that we can provide? And so this is where we come into vagus nerve activation exercises, vagus nerve stimulation potentially as a wonderful tool to be able to enable that. It's really, it comes down to that control piece for me. And that control mechanism, are we able to shift that dimmer switch from being hyper on in that sympathetic state, bring it down slowly, and get to a point where we can actively go into sympathetic when necessary, because it's not a bad thing, and actively be able to bring it back down to parasympathetic when that's necessary, and be able to control how we use, for lack of a better word, accelerator and brakes, right? It comes down to that.
Yeah. And I just to riff off what you're saying there for 1 second, you mentioned the alpha 7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, which is what we talk a lot about the fact that when you activate the vagus nerve, you're causing the release of acetylcholine, both centrally and peripherally. And that leads to a state change in the immune system. So you are regulating inflammation. But to your point, that same receptor is also located on the mitochondria, which was sort of a big aha moment. This is now almost 10 years old, but I don't think widely appreciated, because the excitement around vagus nerve stimulation is mostly around the control of the immune system. But remember that third leg of the stool, which you brought up right at the very beginning, which is metabolism and controlling how the mitochondria function. I'm not necessarily adhering to the mitochondrial theory of aging or disease. There's people out there who are advocating that even cancer is just a metabolic condition. They might not be wrong, but there's probably more to it than that. But at the end of the day, you want to control both inflammation and metabolism. And it's just fascinating to me that Mother Nature put that same acetylcholine receptor, that same alpha 7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptor on both the immune cells, which we know that vagus nerve stimulation can regulate, and on mitochondria. And that mitochondria it's amazing the benefits of acetylcholine on mitochondrial function. So the three legs of that stool are all working together to support health. As you said, it doesn't cure anything, but it creates the environment in you so that you can heal. Because you can't simultaneously be in an inflamed state, in an energy deficit state, and in a sympathetically activated state and heal. You can't do that. You have to have all three of those systems in the right state, and then you can heal.
I feel like you guys are definitely the right people to say this to, because, I definitely was super into the neuroinflammatory thing for years, and it's still, the huge focal point. But obviously, we have to be careful about not being biased as clinicians, practitioners, researchers, because we don't want to get excessively myopic on like, this is the end all be all thing. And so something that I've been observing, and a lot of it's through the research I'm doing with, my mental map panel and just observing so many of these biomarkers. And then, like how nervous system regulation, which my friend Nicole LaPera like really popularized that sort of terminology. Like I kind of miss the days when we called it allostatic dysfunction or HPA, but nervous system regulation, that's become, the trendy phrase. But I will say, and obviously, like, I'm big on specificity of like, how do we qualify things, right? If we're going to tell somebody they have inflammation or they have neuroinflammation, how do we objectively, qualify that, right? And obviously commercially available like lab testing and gadgets, that's the best we have unless we can put them in a research lab. But the point I want to make is something I'm starting to appreciate more and more is we can have massive autonomic dysregulation, but not really have measurable inflammation or even neuroinflammation. And so when I think of like the three legs of sort of the mental health stool, or maybe four, I don't know, five, who knows? But like the neuroinflammatory piece, the neurotrophic piece, but the neuroendocrine piece, right? And what I feel like I'm starting to practice, preach, and appreciate more and more is, the neuroendocrine dysregulation, the upregulated sympathetic tone, the immune cell priming that comes from those stress hormones and the cortisol and the glucocorticoids. It seems like the neuroendocrine almost kind of comes before the like chronic neuroinflammation. It's like you almost have to be in this autonomic dysregulation that then feeds into a heightened oxidative inflammatory response. So I'm curious your guys' perspective on that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I really started to focus, when I talk to people is around the fact that short periods of sympathetic activation are not bad. They're actually quite good. They're quite healthy. It's almost like a hormesis effect. You're getting that hormetic challenge to the system that allows you to then slip back into what I call parasympathetic recovery mode that allows you to heal and heal stronger. It's like going out and running. I like to run. I'm a long distance runner, but I know that if I just went out and started running and ran for 24 hours, I'd be broken. What you need to do is go out and run for an hour and come back. And the next day you can run for an hour and 10 minutes. And the next day you can run for an hour and 20 minutes. But you have to get back into that recovery state. So I think you're right that short periods are okay. It's all about recovery. And the question I have is, how long does that parasympathetic recovery have to be activated in order to provide you with a reset? And my suspicion is it's not very long. I think that you can get that in 5 or 10 minutes of true relaxation. Now, the question is, can you really get yourself in there that quickly? That's where vagus nerve stimulation comes in, because it can trigger you into that parasympathetic recovery mode almost instantaneously and keep you there for an extended period of time. But if you need to move back into the sympathetic state, for whether it's to avoid getting eaten by a lion, you can do it. But it helps you move very quickly into that state so that you can shorten the period of time that you need to be in that recovery mode and still get the benefits.
I think what I would even add to that is this concept of the accelerator and brakes kind of works for this, because a car is only effective when it has both, right? If the accelerator and the motor are not working on this car, then pushing the accelerator, it's not going to go anywhere. It's a hunk of junk sitting in the garage. Where a car without effective brakes is actually dangerous, right? It becomes a danger to society, to those around, to the pedestrians, to the other cars. And that's the sympathetic side of things, right? When the accelerator is on, we need to be able to slow it down, and control of that accelerator function is great. The accelerator is necessary. It's the way we get places, but the brakes are necessary in the recovery piece. And I agree. There's a concept called active recovery at the end of a workout, for example, right? And I've been weight training now for about a year and a half, nowhere near Brendan, but doing something. And what I'm finding is, as your heart rate is elevated and you're working out and you're in this sympathetic state, you require a very short amount of time if you've trained it effectively. And this is a key component to individuality. If this person has done this many times and has gone into that sympathetic state, coming back to parasympathetic becomes much more easy. And it's something that can be trained. It's something that can be taught. It is part of this neuroplastic network of, here's what I need to do when I feel like I'm hyperactivated. And so you go and you sit, or you lie down and you do a little bit of deep breathing, focus on diaphragmatic, focus on nasal, slow everything down, listen to slow music. This concept, Andy Galpin actually did a really good set of these on the Huberman Lab stuff, on how do we initiate that recovery process. And one of the markers that helps to identify this is, how quickly does your heart rate come down? That heart rate recovery concept. And I talk a lot about it in the new book. So how quickly you are able to shift that state and teach yourself to shift that state literally comes down to your resilience and your ability to go sympathetic to parasympathetic as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, those who tend to deal with more chronic health conditions lack that resilience to be able to shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic effectively. And so that's the whole process of what I do with people, is I teach them how to come back to parasympathetic, teach them how to create that active recovery. And not just with exercise, but with all the other things that can trigger a sympathetic activity or a sympathetic signal going out to their cells.
It's cool to this conversation's really becoming well-rounded and coming full circle, because hearing you talking about like weightlifting, exercise recovery, heart rate recovery, and JP mentioned being an endurance athlete. Like just this morning, I posted on Instagram about volume of oxygen, VO2, right? One of my credentials is I'm a metabolic technician. And back in my fitness career, that was one of my favorite things. Like I loved the metabolic testing and the lab testing, right? Where, we see very clearly like a low volume of oxygen, the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can use under exercise stress, a low VO2 as a marker of cardiovascular, cardiometabolic, fitness associated with all-cause mortality, neurodegeneration, heart disease, depression, you name it. The ability to, because like we're talking so much about autonomic regulation and mitochondrial function and inflammation, the ability to increase your body's capacity to oxygenate itself. It's arguably the most fundamental aspect of health. And JP, to your point, not all sympathetic stressors are bad, right? Exercise is the perfect analogy. You go in the weight room and you're causing micro tears to your sarcomeres and everything, and then you give it the rest of recovery to rebuild back up. And for me, my first love in life was martial arts. I started karate as a young kid. And so obviously the proprioception and the athleticism and the fitness component, but the mindfulness and the control of breath, you're sparring and then trying to control your breathing through rounds, that deep diaphragmatic breathing and everything. So something, this is my fitness bias and stuff, but when I see so much content on social media of how do you regulate the nervous system, it's like maybe move your body, maybe exercise, maybe to your guys' point, resilience is earned. A high VO2 score is earned. Metabolic flexibility is earned. And, you do that by pushing into that stressful sympathetic place, and then obviously the backing off in the recovery. And so whether it's heart rate variability, vagus nerve exercises, VO2 measurements, and RMR, we have a lot of cool data points that we can capture to then illustrate how efficaciously is our workout regimen or our lifestyle regimen and everything. So it's cool seeing all these elements that we're talking about kind of converging together here.
Yeah, and I just want to again put a plug in for the metabolic measurements as well. You've got things like insulin resistance measurements and glucose intolerance measurements. And I was just reading some articles that talk about, even at the age of 20 years old in people with BMIs that have never been over 22 or 23, simply being sedentary is enough to turn you into an insulin resistant individual. You're not going to evidence that with HbA1c levels that are high. You're not going to have circulating levels of glucose that are high, but you're still going to have a level of insulin resistance that is frankly not healthy. So it's really, really important to get out and be active. And one of the things that I've become personally recently very fascinated with is the role of nutrient sensing versus sort of that intermittent fasting triggered autophagy that you get inside the cell. That activation of mTOR by nutrients sort of triggers growth. And if you go through a fasting period, then the cells that are now starved for nutrients have to recycle. And I think of it as like spring cleaning / recycling that takes place in the cell, and it clears things out. It activates, a rejuvenation, if you will, of cellular function and metabolic function. One of the best ways to activate that process is through activating AMP kinase, which is what you trigger when you exercise. And, especially that endurance exercise, which I really like. But, endurance exercise is triggering that level of sort of more efficient oxidative phosphorylation, better mitochondrial function, healthier metabolism, in part because it's triggering that autophagy that's clearing out the garbage from your cells. And the one last piece I'll say is that I've always been of the understanding, from way back, that cells like your muscle cells and your fat cells require insulin in order to take up glucose. That your central nervous system and your immune system don't. They have alternative mechanisms for taking up glucose. But it turns out that endurance exercise and the triggering of AMP kinase triggers, even in muscle cells and fat cells, the ability to take up glucose in an insulin independent way. And so, even if you have a little bit of that insulin resistance, you get to that point. And from my own personal experience, when you start running, you get out there and you start running and you haven't been doing it for months or even years. And maybe it's even the first time you get out there, it's really hard. It's really hard. And if you just sort of keep at it, walk if you have to, you get to the point where, all of a sudden, and it may take you a year to get there at my age. I'm 55, it takes a long time, but you get to that point where you suddenly feel as if you could run forever. And that's that feeling where it doesn't hurt anymore. Now it's just fun. It just feels really good. And where you are metabolically is at that point where you no longer need the insulin. You can run without the insulin because your metabolism is now capable of providing the energy that you need through that AMP kinase pathway, through the ability to take up what it needs without insulin.
It's like metabolic flow state.
Yeah, exactly. I love that term. I love that term.
Yeah, I was going to say that metabolic flexibility, it's earned. I like fitness because it's kind of the great equalizer. It's like you get out of it what you put into it, and there's no substitute. We can give all the supplements and biohacks and stuff, but yeah, I think I love the AMP kinase and mTOR autophagy. And one of the things recently I was posting about, you guys will appreciate it. Of, typically when we think of like fasting or caloric restriction, it's like, okay, well, it increases autophagy. But actually, like in the brain, I think it's the hypothalamus, don't quote me on that, but in different regions of the brain, fasting will actually inhibit autophagy in those brain regions, but upregulate neuroplasticity. And it's cool because like scientists are sort of theorizing of like, well, why would this make sense from like an evolutionary perspective? It's like, well, if you're like a fasting caveman and AKA you're in an energy scarce environment, you might starve to death. Like you need that neuroplasticity to adapt, to overcome, to sort of, think your way out of the situation. You have to have that sort of plasticity and malleability with your neural networks, figure out like, well, where's my next meal going to come from so I don't starve to death? So, a lot of times when I'm talking about neuroplasticity and neuroinflammation, I'm a big psychedelic advocate, but like because of how they work, but exercise. Like I was lecturing at like IMMH a few years ago, hundreds of psychiatrists in the audience and stuff. And when I was preaching about like exercise, sunlight being like major stimulators of neuroplasticity, neurotrophic signaling, they were all just like baffled and everything. And I'm like, well, guys, low hanging fruit, because even your muscle cells, like brain derived neurotrophic factor, it got its name because they thought it was brain derived. And then now they realize, oh, actually, when you move your body and you work your skeletal muscle, it produces metabokine or brain derived neurotrophic factor. And they're looking at using, exogenous injected BDNF as treatment for type 1 diabetes because it regenerates the beta cells of the pancreas. It inhibits gluconeogenesis and glucose excursion, right? So there's so many cool things that come back to, thinking of your muscles as a healing organ system that has to be stimulated, that has to be worked.
Yeah, I think muscle's been heavily overlooked for way too long, and we're finally in a situation where we have wonderful books and amazing people like you to bring these concepts to the masses and say, listen, like humans were built to move. We were built to move, and when we move, we function better. Every part of us. We don't build muscle for muscle. Yes, it looks good, but we build muscle so that our entire body functions better. Muscle is absolutely a healing organ. I love that you put it that way. And I don't think I'm glad we're at the point where people are finally being able to hear this as this is the real science. And if we could put exercise in a pill and sell it, it would be the most effective supplement of all time.
So this is like the perfect time to quote one of my favorite quotes of all time, which is Soren Kierkegaard, his comment about walking. He said, above all, do not lose your desire to walk. Every day I walk myself into a state of well-being and walk away from every illness.
I love it.
I have walked myself into my best thoughts, and I know of no thought so burdensome that one cannot walk away from it. And it goes on to talk about the fact that if you stop walking, that's the fastest way to start feeling sick. So I read an article that talked about the fact that being sedentary, sitting was the new smoking. And I think that's exactly right. We have the ability to teach our brains and teach our bodies that we're healthy simply by getting up and moving.
I like that quote. I don't know that one. I know, I think it was Hippocrates that said walking is man's best medicine or something to that effect. But I liked that quote a lot.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's one of my favorites.
That's awesome. Well, speaking of sitting for too long, I do want to be aware of the time and your schedule. And thank you so much for joining us today. For anybody who is still with us on the podcast here, we will definitely share the link to Brendan's course. If you really want to dig in for 38 and a half more hours, you absolutely can. We can dig into the microglial stuff and we'll share that with everybody. And so thanks so much for joining us, Brendan. Absolutely a pleasure having you with us.
Oh, no. Yeah, thank you both. Like genuinely, I live for conversations like this. So this was really a pleasure, and we'll have to run it back on my podcast next time.
Wonderful.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening. Well, we'll see you on the next one. And please feel free to share this with one person who you think could benefit from this information. Wish you all upgraded health. Thanks so much.